Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's TxDOT Roadside Chat. My name is Laura Cruzada, and I'm the Public Involvement Specialist here for TxDOT's Environmental Affairs Division. I'll be joined today by archaeologist Dr. Kevin Hinselka, as well as one of the direct descendants of the site we'll be discussing today, Howard Clark. We'll also be joined by lead historian Rebecca DeBrasco and our Public Information Officer, Emily McCann. Our webinar today will be slightly different from our prior webinars, as we hope to hold a more informal conversation about the archaeological site and its significance in Texas. It's a really exciting discovery, and we want it to be a more conversational rather than a presentation. And we really do want you to ask your questions throughout and send them to us via the Q&A or the chat box. Just for your information, at TxDOT, we're continuing to do business with many of us still teleworking and navigating the virtual world. So we do appreciate your time and attention and hope that today's webinar will go off without a hitch and that technology will be on our side. So please bear with us, and thanks again. And if we do encounter any technical issues, please feel free to reach out to us via the chat, and we'll try to get to your issues throughout the webinar. Before we begin, just a few things. Today's webinar includes some PowerPoint slides, so if you're only joining by phone, we can work with you to get a copy of the presentation after today, but we also will be recording it and it'll be posted on our website, www.txdot.gov, keyword search roadside chat. If you have any questions during the webinar, type it into the chat box and Q&A and we'll address it throughout the presentation. The Q&A will be at the very end. Lastly, there are several hundred people who registered for today's webinar. Although you can't see the attendee list, we on our side see who you are. So thanks for joining, and you will be automatically muted. The speakers and presenters do have videos, so here we go. Our agenda today will include a little bit about what our historic preservation program is and our Beyond the Road campaign. We'll talk more about our discoveries in Bolivar, and then we'll finish with a Q&A and wrap up around 1:30. Before we begin, whether you're new or a veteran to our Roadside Chat webinar, I'd like to plug in for our next event. It's going to be on May 26th at 1 p.m., and you can learn a little bit more about the legacy and status of our roadside parks in Texas, the architect who came up with the idea, and how you can get more involved with TxDOT's historic preservation program. You'll have an opportunity to hear from our historian, a landscape architect, and the director of maintenance. You can register for the webinar at txdot.gov, keyword search roadside chat. We've also developed a webpage to feature all of the roadside chats, and you can check it out to see all of our previous webinars or register for an upcoming event. On the screen, you can see a list of some of the topics that we'll be covering in the future. I'd now like to hand it over to our lead historian, Rebecca DeBrasco, who's going to give you a brief overview about our program.
Thank you so much, Laura. As you look at this slide, this may be what you think TxDOT does. We ruin your commute by having construction, asking you to expect delays, and deal with congestion on our highways. When we start talking about the work that we do, we hear from a lot of people that TxDOT just creates a lot of construction delays and traffic problems. However, did you know that TxDOT is responsible for some of the state's most amazing discoveries? For example, we discovered the interspace caverns during our construction of Interstate 35 north of Austin. We actually punched through the roof of the caverns trying to build a bridge on I-35. Today, you can take a tour of the cavern and learn more about Texas's geology and landscapes. Our preservation efforts also work to maintain old buildings like the one you just saw, located on Route 66. Teams of archaeologists, historians, and environmental scientists work with our engineers every day to plan around the state's historic, natural, and cultural resources before we build roads and bridges. Our Environmental Affairs Division integrates natural, historical, and community resources into consideration before we even start construction on any project. Whether TxDOT is building a new bridge, repairing damaged roadways after natural disasters, or creating safer intersections, our teams help our districts manage progress with the preservation of our environmental resources. This means we consider how noise levels will change as a result of a project. We listen to community concerns. We examine project areas to determine if they're historical or archaeological sites. And we even study the wildlife in a project area to identify plants or animals at risk. All of this work happens before construction even begins, and it happens every single day, even though many people don't know about it. While this information may be new to you, TxDOT has been conducting this work for a long time. In fact, this year, TxDOT's archaeology has been examining sites that are significant to Texas for 50 years. In 1970, TxDOT was the first agency to conduct permitted archaeology in Texas. And before that, more projects were completed through private researchers. Since then, we've dug up tens of thousands of cubic feet of dirt and uncovered some pretty amazing stories. The work conducted by our archaeologists and historians is guided by federal laws, like the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Policy Act that you may know of as NEPA. These laws require us to stop, look, and listen for cultural resources before beginning construction. So what exactly are cultural resources? These are the historic places and spaces that make your communities unique and special. As TxDOT builds roads and bridges, historians and archaeologists review how transportation projects might affect Texas history, heritage, and cultural environment. Cultural resources can include historic buildings and bridges, archaeological sites and cemeteries, historic neighborhoods or downtowns, sacred or religious landmarks and sites, and historic objects and landscapes. But just because a building, bridge, or other type of structure is old, it doesn't mean it really just gets preserved as is. Preservation has a different meaning under the regulations that we work for, as does the word historic. So for a place to be considered, quote, historic in our process, it has to be at least 50 years old. It has to have a documented connection with a historic event or notable person. It has to have notable architectural or engineering design, or it must contain information that contributes to our knowledge of Texas's past. If a property is deemed significant enough, it can then be considered for listing in our National Register of Historic Places. And TxDOT considers how our projects may affect those properties. If a project is negatively impacted by construction, TxDOT looks for preservation outcomes, which can happen in many ways, and is something we decide in consultation with our preservation partners. This effort of making up for negative impacts to historic or archaeological sites is called mitigation. And it is through mitigation that we can save the stories and significance of these places for future generations to enjoy. Addressing cultural resources is just one step in the environmental review process that we put all projects through. It's part of what we do beyond the road. We are actually just one small piece of a bigger program that looks at a host of environmental impacts during project planning. I mentioned some of these, but here are some other resources that we consider. When we find unique stories, we create brochures, short videos, podcasts, posters, and more. as part of our outreach and education campaign that we call Beyond the Road. We want to share the stories that make Texas unique, and this campaign allows us to bring these stories to you. But that's not all. Part of our program involves you, the public. We want you to join us and voice your concerns on projects, help us brainstorm ways to mitigate impacts, and help us understand what is important to you. To help you understand how your participation can help us, we provide information about past projects, discoveries, and how they were made possible on our website, and we hope you will be involved with us on future projects. Please visit us at TxDOT.gov, keyword Beyond the Road, to learn more about these projects in the past and how you can be involved. If you're interested, we also have more on our website. There are many materials online, and we're about to introduce even more. Soon, we will be launching a booklet and virtual trainings that go even more in depth about our historic preservation process and how you can fit in to that process. I hope you stay tuned for that. And now, let's dig into today's programming. Before we jump into our conversation, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the sites we uncovered in Denton County. Archeologists from TxDOT and Cox McLean Environmental Consulting have spent many weeks digging into the past near a part of town formerly associated with Bolivar, Texas. The first site, the Sarton Hotel, was owned and operated by Jesse Sarton beginning in 1881. After conducting a series of oral interviews, TxDOT and Cox McLean learned that this hotel was a stop on the Chisholm Trail, which was a well-known cattle drive trail. It also served as a stagecoach stop of overland lines throughout the county. The hotel was a two-story L-shaped wood building, and it had a flowing well in the lobby. Our team uncovered that well, as well as many artifacts, including a porcelain doorknob, whiteware, which is dishware, a bone-handled knife, and a ceramic jug. The second site is Tom Cook's Blacksmith shop, and that will be the focus of today's conversation. Tom Cook was born enslaved in South Carolina sometime between 1826 and 1840. The records are not clear. He was brought to Texas as an enslaved person in 1857, and he became a free man with the rest of Texas's enslaved population on Juneteenth, 1865. Tom Cook owned and operated a local blacksmith shop in Denton County shortly thereafter. This is incredibly rare for both the time period and the location in Texas. While we will dig deeper in a moment to discuss the findings at this location, some of the artifacts uncovered included the wedge end of a classic blacksmith hammer, the working end of a pair of blacksmith tongs used to hold hot iron pieces, and an assortment of horse gear, wagon pieces, and a dugout structure. We are joined today by the Public Information Officer for this project, Emily McCann. Thank you for joining us, Emily. What can you tell us about your role with this project? And is this something you regularly do at TxDOT?
Hi, well, thank you so much for having me, Laura, Rebecca. It's great to see y'all. As a public information officer for the TxDOT Dallas district, my job is to communicate clearly and inform the public of TxDOT projects, lane closures, public meetings, and answer any questions that the public might have. I also field media inquiries and interviews on behalf of TxDOT. And I have never actually had the opportunity to work on an archaeological project in my TxDOT career until now. And so my main role for this project is to communicate with the public about the history of the site, inform folks of the findings through the media and our own publications, and help spread awareness about TxDOT's role in preserving history. And so today, we're joined by one of TxDOT's archaeologists, Kevin Hinselka. Kevin, can you please tell us about yourself, your role here at TxDOT, maybe a little bit about why you were interested in archaeology and how you came to work for the department.
Okay. Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Kevin Hinselka. To answer your question, Emily, I've been in archaeology for about 2 decades now, more than 2 decades. I worked at a number of contracting firms after going to school for a long time. This is now my 7th year at TxDOT, working as an archaeologist. And I'm one of about 10 archaeologists working across the state.
So we know, like you said, TxDOT has archaeologists who are working all across the state, but what led you to this little patch of Denton County?
Yes, well, I do have numerous projects across the whole state, including North Texas, as well as way out west and west, the El Paso area. But what brought me to Denton County in this case was the expansion of FM 455 between Bolivar and Sanger up in Denton County. And we had to do archaeological research to see what kind of resources would have been impacted during that project.
Okay, so once you determined that an archaeological investigation was necessary for the project, how did you decide where to dig? Kind of walk us through your search technique and how you chose the locations for the plots that you guys excavated.
Okay, as Laura and Rebecca summarized earlier, every time there's a highway project, we have to go in and determine whether there would be resources affected by that project. This can be as simple as a background study that is done at your desktop on the computer, but if there is high potential for unknown and important materials in that right-of-way, in that what we call the area of potential effects, we actually have to go into the field and perform archaeological surveys to see if there's anything present there. And then we evaluate the significance of those materials and whether anything, any additional investigation is going to be required. So in this case, we did a background study that indicated, yes, we needed to do a survey. We sent a crew out to do a survey. We do this years in advance. I mean, the first survey out there was in 2016. Then in 2019, we went back out and completed the survey on areas that we didn't have access to. And it was during those surveys that we encountered these sites. And depending on the condition of the sites, the kind of information that we can get out of them, we determine whether first a smaller scale excavation is going to take place. And if that justifies a bigger excavation, we go out there one more time for what's called data recovery. And that's what happened in this case here.
So this was a little bit more of a larger space to dig up. Did y'all have any help when you were excavating the site?
Absolutely. With only 10 of us on staff, we can't do this work ourselves. So we contract various environmental consulting firms to perform our field work. In this case, we got Cox McLean Environmental Consulting out there. Mr. Doug Boyd was the principal investigator and project archaeologist in this case. Doug is an experienced historical archaeologist with lots of experience in sites like this. So we had him in charge, as well as a really good field crew. It takes a small army, as a matter of fact. We want to give thanks to we had a couple of backhoe operators because some of our excavations require heavy machinery. We have Cox McLean historians. We have Dr. Maria Franklin, who is a University of Texas historical archaeologist specializing in African American studies, doing background research. So yes, there's a lot of people involved. The North Texas Archaeological Society provided volunteers who were out there daily screening the sediments that we were excavating and recovering artifacts. I could go on and on just on that topic alone. Real quick, I do want to thank my colleague at TxDOT, Walter Terrell, who is also very interested in this topic and has basically been co-managing the project with me.
So it sounds like a lot of hands were involved, and I can imagine that y'all got some strange looks from people as they drove past the excavation sites. It's a small town out there in rural Denton County. Did anyone stop by while y'all were digging? And can you tell us a little bit about the general community's response to this project?
Absolutely, yes. We had lots of traffic. It is at the intersection of FM 455 and FM 2450, so there was a lot of cars going through there, and a lot of people stopped. On a daily basis, they would have anywhere from one to multiple visitors stop by to see what we were finding. Lots of local interest, local landowners who have a deep connection to this community were very, very helpful and provided information and provided access. So generally, everybody was very interested in what we were doing, and some folks visited multiple times as they passed by.
So when did the excavation for this project begin, and how long has it gone on?
Well, preparations for something like this takes months and months, but the actual field work began in about mid-October. We were out there for the first time. It starts with mapping the site and general site preparation. In this case, we had a specialist in remote sensing who does things like ground penetrating radar, things that they could test to see what's underground before we even break the ground, and that's how it starts. But the excavations actually took place between mid-October to about early to mid-February. So they were out there for several months. Sometimes for the most part, it was 5 days a week, but at the very end, there were a couple of stints where it was 10 straight days out there just trying to finish up and get things wrapped up. So it took a while.
So is that amount of time, is that typical for these type of TxDOT projects? And how often do you actually get to this type of excavation phase with other type of projects?
It is pretty typical for something of this level. Testing projects, smaller projects may take several weeks, but larger excavations, it's not unusual for them to go on for months like this. As to how often it happens, under normal circumstances, we may get 2 or 3 of these a year, but it seems like the last couple of years, all across the state, we've had numerous data recovery level things going on. So we usually have several per year, more so at the testing level. And surveys we basically have going on all the time.
So one quick follow-up question I have for you. So we are joined together virtually due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Did the pandemic slow y'all down at all? I know you were still working with, personal protection equipment, 6 feet apart, masks, but did you see any delays because of the pandemic?
Not really. We planned very well for that kind of thing. We insisted on that, and people were not working very closely together. Everyone was wearing masks under normal circumstances, and it did not cause any delays. But we knew what the precautions had to be in order to do something like this.
So, talk to me about what a typical day might be like on some of these sites.
Okay. A typical day would be to arrive early, and for something like this with so many different things going on, Doug had his hands full directing people to get going in different directions. On some sites such as this, you might have a backhoe operating on certain parts of the site, scraping away things, the top layers of things that we know didn't have anything in them, for example. But different people working on different parts of the site, hand excavating features or units looking for artifacts. We had people working in teams where one would be excavating, others would be carrying buckets of that dirt over to a screen, dumping it through the screen, looking for artifacts, people filling out paperwork. So it's a pretty busy place. And in this case, the excavation started at the Sarton Hotel, which is on the north side of FM 455. But a few weeks into that, some activity shifted to the south side of FM 455 to the other site that we were investigating. So there was a brief period in the middle where we had crews working on 2 different sites right nearby. So lots of activity.
So how common would it be to find sites like Tom Cook's Blacksmith shop and the Sarton Hotel site? By that, I mean sites that don't fall under the category of like ancient archaeology.
Prehistoric archaeology versus historic. We find all kinds of sites very often. Historic sites in particular are very often because there was a lot of occupation of the landscape. People were everywhere. Often those sites are just little scatters of artifacts like broken glass or, nothing too important. We will record them and move on and not do anything. Finding important sites that are worth excavating is not very common. When I say worth excavating, it depends on, again, the level of information they hold, how intact they are, and whether, if they're really disturbed, then that the information potential drops, so we don't feel the need to excavate them so thoroughly. And another criteria that we use to determine the significance of a site is, in addition to how much information it might hold, is are they associated with important people in the past? In this case, and that's what applies here. We're going to be talking more about the blacksmith shop. It's very rare to find a blacksmith shop, at least in Texas, archaeologically. There is a lot of information we can gain from a site like this. Especially, we determined early on that it was going to have a lot of artifacts and a lot of information. And then when it became apparent that it was owned by Mr. Tom Cook, a previously enslaved man, shortly after the Civil War, that significance just went even further up. So to answer your question, it's not uncommon that we find such sites, but it's not every day. And so this was a pretty unique opportunity that doesn't happen very often.
So we talked a little bit about some of the artifacts. So I want to dig a little bit deeper on that in the sites themselves. So let's start with the Sarton Hotel. We know that Jesse Sarton was in Bolivar by 1870. As Laura previously said, it opened the hotel sometime in the 1880s. What type of artifacts did you find at this site?
Lots of household debris, things you would expect to find in a hotel. You can see architectural materials like the doorknob in the picture there. The most apparent thing that we found right off the bat, well, under survey, we just found artifacts coming out of shovel tests, which are small holes that you poke in the ground to see if there's anything buried there. But during testing, the photo to the left there, they found the alignment of large limestone blocks that turned out to be the foundation of the hotel. And particularly along the north wall there, which would be the wall on the right-hand side of the photo, there was a huge deposit of artifacts of various kinds. Bone-handled knife. There was some animal bone, probably associated with meals that were cooked there. Lots of pieces of a cast iron stove, which was pretty interesting. Eventually we did find the well, the water well, which is the photograph in the upper right-hand corner there. Rebecca mentioned this earlier. Actually, this is the water well that would have served that hotel, but there is, in some archival documents, this discussion of they variously described it as a duck pond or a flowing well or a fountain or things like that. That's what we were looking for, but we did not find. We're not sure what they were talking about there, if they were talking about the well that we did discover, or if they were not, then there was no evidence left of this pond that they discussed. But so yeah, it was a wide, we have abundant artifacts to work with, and just need to add right now that all of our discussion right now is very preliminary, because now that the field work is over, all the analysis starts and the interpretation, and it's going to be ongoing for quite a while.
So you mentioned the cast iron stove. Why was it surprising to find that?
Why was it exciting to find that?
Or surprising, as you
surprising. Not necessarily surprising, but what's interesting, especially with historical sites like this, is some of the fragments of this cast iron stove actually had a brand name written on or stamped on it that we can track where it came from, where it was produced, where they bought it from, how old it is. And incidentally, the interpretation's still ongoing, but based on where these artifacts were, we kind of have an idea of how the hotel was demolished after it was abandoned. And because all of those artifacts were not on the ground where they would have fallen in the structure itself, they were pushed to one side. Another thing we did find that I did mention a while ago is, right near the water well, we found a pulley casing and a wire bucket handle with a chain still attached to it that probably would have been used to dip into the well to pull out water.
So you mentioned finding the name brand of the manufacturer of the cast iron stove. Did you do any other sort of research in libraries or other facilities to learn more about the hotel or the artifacts that you found?
Oh yes, that's a very big part of a project like this. It's an advantage that historic sites have over prehistoric sites because there's no written record. But in a case like this, we have historians working at Cox McLean that will be working on this for over the next year or two, trying to tease out the local history of this site and who was involved with its occupation. Incidentally, some of the artifacts that we found, like Cox McLean had on the site an 1897 Sears Roebuck catalog where you can identify artifacts based on what they were selling at the time. So,
wow.
Yes. But in a site such as this, it was very important to the foundation of Bolivar. The famous outlaw Sam Bass probably stayed at this hotel. These are reasons why we wanted to excavate and get as much information from it as we could.
So you kind of talk about the community itself. Based on what you found and the additional research that's been done, how bustling was Bolivar about 150 years ago? And maybe why did it wane?
That's a good question. It was the population probably was, I don't believe it was very large back then, but it was a prosperous town. Especially at this time period because of the Chisholm Trail, which went probably a couple of miles from here. There were a lot of businesses. The hotel, there was 2 stagecoach lines. There was a lot of people stayed in the hotel. There was a saloon. Of course, there was the blacksmith shop. So it was pretty successful. It probably the decline was, I believe it was due to the establishment of the railroad, which rather than putting it through Bolivar, they put it through Sanger, which drew a lot of commerce and a lot of attention away from Bolivar. So that's probably led to, I wouldn't call it a decline, but it was not as prosperous as it used to be at that point. That's my understanding of it.
So now that you've completed the excavations, is that correct? The excavations have been completed at the Sarton Hotel site. What happens to the site now? And do you remove the features you found, take soil samples, or do you just fill everything back up?
It depends on the site. We take numerous samples during the excavation. We document things as best we can. Some features are excavated in their entirety. Things such as the foundation alignment that you see there were left in place. One of the final things that we do on a site like this is using a backhoe. We scrape the entire site down just to make sure that we didn't miss anything. Archaeology is often a lot about sampling, where you choose little parts of the site to excavate, and it's very easy. You do the best you can, but there's always a chance you're going to miss something. So in this case, Cox McLean scraped the entire site to be sure that there was nothing left there. And ultimately, the site will be covered up either by FM 455 or will be part of the maintained right-of-way. So it'll be under grass. It'll be destroyed. We are pursuing the possibility of preserving that well in the photo there for the future, just to have it in the right-of-way, stabilized for people to visit. That hasn't been established yet, whether we can or do that or not, but it's far enough back from the actual roadway that there's a chance. But otherwise, the site itself will be part of the TxDOT right-of-way at some point.
Well, now that we've talked about the hotel, I kind of want to move to the Tom Cook site. Tom Cook opened a blacksmith shop around the same time. Was the site, I think we kind of established that the site was near the hotel, is that correct?
Yes, actually, it's right across FM 455. The Tom Cook blacksmith shop is at the northwest corner of FM 455 and FM 2450. I believe in the photograph, the road that you see in the background is FM 2450, so you're looking west there. The Sarton Hotel would have been basically immediately to the north of that on the other side of FM 455.
So let's talk a little bit about Tom Cook himself. What do we know about him before this project began, and are there any records of him?
There are. Unfortunately, as is often the case, they're pretty scattered and not a lot of great detail that are at least immediately apparent. So it took a lot of teasing out. There are conflicting stories, but we do know where he is buried. We know, well, we didn't know exactly his birth date. We knew he was formerly enslaved. He and his wife were formerly enslaved in South Carolina before coming to Tarrant County first and then to Denton County to the Bolivar area. So there was a record of him, and that's part of the ongoing research, is to tease out, compile all the evidence and all the archival research that we can about him and learn as much as we can about him as a person.
So I have read some reports that he was a prominent community member in Denton County. What does that mean to you that Tom Cook, a formerly enslaved person, now owns a business in Denton County during the Reconstruction era? What does that mean to you, him being a prominent community member?
Well, that's first and foremost, that's very important right there, is immediately after emancipation, he owned his own business. He was a landowner and was literate. He was, at this time, it says a lot that he was well respected even among the Anglo community there as somebody you can count on when in a time of need. That was one aspect of it. He was a minister, and he was an early civil rights leader. He actually, we believe he was a mentor to future civil rights leader Fred Moore. So he was quite an individual, that's for sure.
How, so, you know, looking back, how would Tom Cook have come to own his blacksmith shop? Do we think that he learned his trade when he was previously enslaved, or what do you think about that?
We're not sure, and that's part of our research, but we speculate that he probably learned blacksmithing as an apprenticeship while he was an enslaved man in South Carolina, most likely. We know he arrived in Tarrant County, I believe, when he was still enslaved in the 1860s. By 1870, when he was a freedman, he was still in Tarrant County, and then he came to Bolivar in the early 1870s. We do have some evidence that on this site there was a blacksmith shop previously, owned by I believe an Englishman named Barntos, I believe. But yeah, there was a blacksmith shop there previously. And there was a time period in the 1870s that Tom Cook probably worked at that blacksmith shop before he owned it. And then it was in the early 80s, he took possession of it, whether he bought it from the previous owner or traded for it, or it was bequeathed to him or whatever. So that's part of our research is to figure out exactly how that happened, but that's the information that we have to this point.
Are there other sites in Texas like this one where you see, you know, a successful formerly enslaved person being freed? And following up on that, what do you think success would have looked like or meant to Tom Cook?
That's a good question. As far as other sites in Texas, we do know of other sites where formerly enslaved people have been successful. Most of the ones we know about are farmsteads. In the early 2000s, again, Cox McLean helped TxDOT excavate a site in Austin called Ransom Williams site, which is a farmstead owned by a formerly enslaved man. But as far as commercial businesses, those are less known. I'm sure they're out there, but we don't have as many of them. Again, pointing to the significance of this site. There are, Doug and I were recently talking about in Guadalupe County, the Wilson family was a family of African-American freedmen who ran, they were ceramic potters that were very successful. So these sites are known, but not very well known. So we're trying to find more of them. But as far as what success would have looked like for Mr. Cook, I can't speak for him, but it sounds like it's based on what we found, he performed a wide range of services on this site, at this shop. So he was probably pretty successful in serving the community. Not the least, in my opinion, the fact that he has a legacy of descendants who still live in the area today. And yeah, I hope that answered your question.
It does, and actually brings me to my next question. So at one point you mentioned descendants. So at one point you invited some descendants to join you at the site. Can you tell us a little bit about that opportunity?
Well, yes, once we started learning more about Mr. Cook and the possibility or the possibility for his relatives still living in the area, it became very apparent that that was one thing that we really wanted to do. Part of TxDOT's mission in public outreach is reaching out to stakeholders and interested parties. This is a very important one. So this is, we started consulting with Dr. Maria Franklin from UT, who has done a lot of our genealogical research, tracking the descendants of Mr. Cook, and involving them in the process from start to finish as best we can. And our purpose is to fully engage with the local community, including not just the lineal descendants of Mr. Cook, but also just any other African-American community members who have a shared heritage with this site.
So you mentioned Maria doing a lot of the genealogical research for this project. What type of documents or records is she looking through, do you know, to find these descendants?
I'm not really sure. There's a lot of it is done with oral interviews and just talking to people in the community, and that's mostly the side of it that I'm aware of. I'm sure there's a lot of looking through census type documentation, things like that, and yeah.
When you do you always invite descendants of communities like this for archaeological projects or archaeological digs?
To the best of our ability. We don't often have so clear an opportunity to do so, but we do try to involve from the start on our projects, and especially important projects that go to data recovery. We try to involve the local community as best we can, and if the opportunity comes up to involve direct descendants, of course we're going to take advantage of that. But of course, a lot of our projects are prehistoric, and there's less of an opportunity. But throughout our process, we involve Native American tribes who have a history with the region in question throughout our process, so that's part of it. But the short answer to your question is we do it when we can, but sometimes it's not as clear an opportunity to do so.
So when you found Descendants, who have you contacted, and what was their response when they were contacted by the project team?
Well, I've been very happy with the response. There has been a great response to it. Maria actually, first and foremost, they contacted Mr. Cook's direct descendants, including Betty Clark Kimball, who is Mr. Cook's great-granddaughter, Mr. Howard Clark, who you're going to hear from here shortly, is Mr. Cook's great-great-grandson. And then Haley Clark Wright is the great-great-great-granddaughter of Mr. Cook and Howard Clark's daughter. But in addition, we also contacted other local African-American residents with an interest in the project, including the local Baptist church congregation. And as an extension of all this, we also involved faculty and students from local the University of North Texas in Denton, including Anthony DeFries, who is a UNT anthropology undergraduate student, was on our excavation crew. And you see him in the picture on the left there giving a presentation at the next event that I want to talk to you about. And December 5th, we actually had 11 individuals, including Mr. Cook's descendants, plus some family friends, come out to the site and have a site tour and listen to Doug and Maria and Anthony discuss the project itself. So it's been a very positive response, and we're very happy with it. But again, this aspect of the project is going to be ongoing for the next several years, probably.
Well, this leads me to my next part of the question. So I know that we are very lucky today to be joined by Tom Cook's great-great-grandson, Howard Clark. And so I do have a couple questions for Howard. And Howard, thank you so much for joining us today, and not just today, but through the life of the project. Your insight about your family has been invaluable. So Howard, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you.
My pleasure.
So Howard, did you know anything about the history of your ancestor before this project?
Not that far back. I knew of his son because that was Jack Cook, who actually my dad loved and hung out with and talked about all the time. I mean, my grandfather was there also, but Jack Cook was more the horseman and the outdoorsman and the hunter and the whatever. So Daddy hung out with him all the time. Betty talks about him riding on the back of the horse with him all over the place, and just, Daddy talked about him all the time. So
wow,
that was as far back. And I knew a little bit about the actual Clark side that was just down the road about 4 miles from this location. But that was, as far as the Cook side, that was about as far as I knew back. And I didn't know much about, I didn't really understand who Uncle Jack was until almost recently. I mean, who he was, related to and why. And yeah, I've heard it, but, at some point when you're young, you don't think a lot about it. You just kind of, oh yeah, that was my great grandmother's brother,
Right. So I guess one of my other questions is, how did you feel when you were contacted about the site, and what was that site visit like for you as a descendant?
Well, I felt when I heard about it was, I was curious. I thought, well, that's kind of good. I'm going to need to be able to go back a little farther. But I think they talked to Aunt Betty, and they had talked to my daughter first, my younger daughter, Haley. And I was just going to sit back and just hear what I could or find out what I could from them until she wanted to speak to me. And then it became more interesting, I wanted to be more involved with it. And like I said, I wasn't sure what to expect, but I didn't know how much I had to offer either. So but I wanted to be involved, and it was a chance to learn more about where I came from. So I was definitely all in.
I know it seems like a very unique opportunity. So did this project provide you with that opportunity to connect with maybe other descendants who were not previously known to you?
Not yet. We started to we were talking the other night about maybe trying to contact some of those that we believe are still in Oklahoma. Aunt Betty has some vague memories of going to church up there. Her dad would take her up to one of the descendants of one of the relatives' church in Oklahoma. And we were trying to figure out maybe last night, this is probably something my younger daughter Haley will get into and dig a little farther. We were talking about just last night about some of those that are in Fort Worth that we're trying to recontact. Some of them are, older, maybe some medical issues now, a little, the memory part may not be so well, but it's triggered, some more forward motion, but I haven't contacted anybody yet that I wasn't aware of, I guess I would say.
So I guess you mentioned that you have family that is kind of in Tarrant County and in the DFW area. Has your family kind of always been in the DFW area?
As far as I know as far back as, my dad, my grandparents on my dad's side, and my mom's, they come from East Texas. But yes, ma'am, as far back as I can recollect, most of it's Fort Worth. There's a few in California, but most of them are here. There's the one branch up in Michigan. But for the most part, we're around here somewhat close.
It's very interesting to know that it's only like a few miles from this excavation site. So, and we have a few pictures actually on the screen for those of us joining virtually of you volunteering at the site. So what was it like for you to participate in this excavation process?
Well, it's kind of like Christmas every day. I never knew what was going to pop up or what we were going to find. And, every day it's like, okay, yesterday was this, and this. Wonder what it'll be today. I still, even now, since then, have not stopped every day wondering what he would have been doing today. What did they eat? What was he eating? When we would find the whiteware or the parts and pieces of plates and even some silverware, I just wondered, well, was this lunch? Where did he sit? Where did he eat? What did he do? He held this in his hand. I wonder what he thought. I wonder what he'd think about me if he could see me today. I tinker with, and I'm starting to get even more into the blacksmithing and stuff myself, the knife maker prior to, but his technique, I wondered what he learned, where he learned it, how he would have done some of the things I'm trying to learn to do. It swirled into a whole lot of things.
So what was the interesting thing that you learned?
Sorry?
What was the most interesting thing that you learned?
I guess the most interesting thing was the fact that he was able to do all this in a time when he shouldn't have been able to, maybe. That he was able to, that he had a business that, way out in places where we figure he might not have been too welcome, but he still thrived or managed to. And why he would have passed up maybe the bigger places like Denton or why he didn't stay in Fort Worth. What brought him out there. But the most interesting thing, like I said, is just the fact that what he did with his hands and the abilities he must have had, when I started to see the tools and the parts of tools and things like that, it kind of flows into how my dad was. I mean, could build, fix anything with his hands, and was my dad's theme his whole life was that nobody will outwork him. And that followed from his athletics to everything, every day. And like I said, that was all interesting to me. It's just kind of how some of the traits you still see today. I still notice in my relatives.
Sounds like and perseverance were a family trait for y'all. So is there anything else that you want to share with us, Howard?
Well, I just, I noticed in one of the questions that asked what would I like the community or the state of Texas to take away from this. And I guess the one thing that I think about is that there were a whole lot of people that are less popular. You may have never heard their name or whatever, but, black and white, not just black, but, obviously I'm speaking from the black perspective, but that had significant roles to play in making the community what it was, maybe even more so than the famous names you hear. Some of them passed through and you say, well, so-and-so was here at one point and they went on to greatness, whatever else. But these people stayed and they dug in and they made do with what they had and they made it what it is, but you very seldom hear about them. And I think their stories are fascinating. Maybe because they are less heard of or less popular. And like I said, and one of the bonus was I got to find out his final resting place and actually go to it. And I've got to go up, and the guy said I could cut a path through so I could take my Aunt Betty and my mom up to see it. And you can see the picture of my daughter and I.
About what that was like?
I'm sorry?
Can you tell me a little bit about what that was like to see his final resting place?
Well, that was as close as I could get to seeing his final resting place was as close as I know I'll be able to get on this side of eternity to see him or to be near him, to know what he was like. And again, it just started the whole thing swirling again of wondering what he looked like. I almost expected to see him standing off in the distance watching, so it was emotional.
I can imagine. Well, Howard, thank you so much. I just want to give you and your family such special thanks for joining us, sharing your stories, kind of being vulnerable with us today. So thank you so much again. And I know that your input and perspective has been invaluable, not just for the site, but just for history in Denton County in general. So thank you so much. So with a little bit of time that we have left, looks like we're coming up on 1 o'clock. I wanted to turn back to Kevin to talk a bit more specifically about artifacts and features uncovered at the blacksmith shop.
Okay.
So Kevin, we're talking about how this the blacksmith shop site. It's a mouthful. How do you know that? What are the other artifacts that you uncovered at this site? I know we see a picture here of a lot of, looks like metal and tools, but can you give us some perspective on that?
Absolutely, yes. Well, we first became aware of the blacksmith shop when we were doing survey there in 2019 when we poked some shovel test holes in the ground. It just looked like a bare patch of a lot right there, but they started pulling up artifacts that you would expect to find in a blacksmith shop. But then with a little bit further background research, we came across maps that actually that showed a blacksmith shop was on that location, which eventually led us to Mr. Cook. The artifacts that are coming out of there are, for the most part, associated with blacksmithing. This ranges from everything from the raw material, the stock iron that was probably ordered from a Sears Roebuck catalog. You see an example of this material on that table there, but then you have semi-finished and finished products, hand-forged horseshoes, nails, hand-forged nails, products that would have come from this, as well as things that would have gone onto wagons. But I can talk more about that in a minute. But then this ranged all the way up to the tools that were being used during the blacksmith shop, blacksmithing process. Rebecca mentioned earlier we found the business end of a blacksmith's hammer, the tongs that were used to hold hot pieces of iron during the process. But in addition to the blacksmithing artifacts, there were a lesser number of domestic artifacts, including evidence that at some point a family lived on the location. Whether this was associated with Tom Cook's use, I'm not sure, but buttons, I think a few marbles that would have been children's toys were there, beads from a necklace, things like that. So it was a range of artifacts, but mostly associated with the blacksmithing process.
Is there something that you thought you would find in a typical blacksmith excavation site that you thought you'd find, but you ended up not finding?
Well, we hope to find something as significant as an anvil, but we did not find that, or possibly the metal hoops that go on a barrel that he would have been used to dump objects into the water. But things like that, it's not surprising we didn't find them because they would have been carried off either at the abandonment or shortly thereafter. Things like that don't sit still.
Right. Things with like significant value, probably. So, well, based on what you found, what kind of blacksmith work did Tom Cook specialize in? Do you have a good guess about that?
For the most part, he did a wide range of things, but he catered. We have discovered that he was a farrier. He specialized in putting horseshoes on horses. They found the snipped off ends of the nails. When the nail comes up through the horse's hoof, you have to snip the end off, and we found a bunch of those nails. He repaired wagons and saddlery. In addition to doing, he was strategically placed at right at the edge of the community, so he could cater to both rural communities with their agricultural agricultural equipment, wagon parts, saddlery, and stuff like that. But we also found architectural things like hinges and things that he would have been doing for the people in town. And we also have to remember that the Chisholm Trail ran right through there too, so there were ranchers and cowboys passing through that would have needed his services.
So those would probably be who his customers primarily were. We're looking at farmers, passers through. Anyone else that you can think of that might, be a customer of Tom Cook's blacksmith shop?
No, that about covers it. Just the people there in town, people living in the nearby community, as well as people passing through on the Chisholm Trail or on stagecoaches. He was in a good setup to do that kind of work.
So on the next slide, we have a picture of the main structure that was excavated. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, well, first, before I get to this, you call it the main structure. I do have to point out that this is the most visible structure. The main beyond this structure, back where you see the piles of dirt now, would have been the more well, archaeologically, it's less obvious because there would have been the blacksmith shop itself would have been a wooden structure above ground that is no longer there. So Doug and Cox McLean found the footprint of that wooden structure based on, just differences in the soil color and texture, as well as one thing I forgot to mention earlier. One of the more exciting things I learned about is a material called hammer scale, which when you see in person or images of a blacksmith working at his anvil with a hammer, the sparks flying off of that anvil are all microscopic or tiny particles of iron that end up on the floor of his blacksmith shop. So we would take soil samples from our excavation units and using high-powered magnets, pull that stuff out of the dirt. It looks just like dirt, but it's iron. And then looking at how that stuff is scattered across the ground, they found the footprint of where the blacksmith shop would have been. This structure here, from the surface, there were a couple of rocks poking out of the ground. Then as we dug into it, we started thinking it became a big pile of rubble, which our first impression was that might be the forge box, which would have been a stone oven-like structure where he kept a hot fire going for the process. But those forge boxes are typically about 4 or 5 feet square, but this became a very, very large pile of rocks. But as the excavation crew started removing the rocks, they found the walls of this buried, they call it a dugout structure. It was a room that was basically partially dug into the ground. And as the bottom, the floor was reached at about 4 feet, if I'm not mistaken. And yes, it became, this is one of the reasons why the last 2 trips there dragged out into 2 10 days, because suddenly we had this giant thing to excavate. But so yeah, that's an introduction to the part. There would have been a few big wooden posts helping to hold up the roof and the walls of the structure too.
So what do you think the dugout structure was used for? You mentioned there was a wooden structure and then there's a dugout structure. What do you think the dugout structure was used for?
That's something we're trying to work out, because there is documentation that there was a storehouse on the property before Mr. Cook had his business there, and this is most likely some of that structure. Down near the floor, we found some domestic items that indicate that maybe some people were living there at some point. Among the rubble in there was also abundant blacksmithing artifacts as well. So we're still trying to tease out what this structure represents.
You also mentioned forge boxes. What you kind of mentioned what a forge box was, but would this be something that he would use for fuel to heat his blacksmith ovens, or what was the type of fuel he might have used? Because in blacksmithing, heat is a big part of your day-to-day life. What would he use for fuel?
Most likely, and whenever he could, probably most definitely coal. Coal would have been his primary preferred fuel source. But if that was not as available, maybe charcoal, but coal would have been something that he would have wanted to use in the process.
Do we know approximately how big these ovens might have been that held this fuel?
Yeah, it's the forge box would have been, well, they vary in size, but probably around 4 or 5 feet square, 4 or 5 feet on the side, which is one reason why our initial interpretation we realized was we thought, oh, this is either something else entirely or a very, very large forge box, but it became clear that it was something different.
Well, Kevin, as we wrap up this conversation, it's clear that there's a lot of history in Denton County. What makes a site like this significant to record in history?
Well, various things that I think we've at least touched upon in the conversation. For one thing, blacksmith shops are rare to find archaeologically. You can learn a lot from the materials you find in a site like this. What kind of blacksmithing was taking place, what the process that this particular blacksmith used, the economics behind it. Even in the few sites that have been found in Texas, this one has produced abundant artifacts relative to some. It compares well to other sites that are found in other states or that have been excavated. And all of this is not even getting into the personal aspect of it, where this was a formerly enslaved man who did this right after emancipation. So how he managed to do it, and the kind of work that he did and how he served the community and fit into the community are all important questions that we're trying to answer here. So from the surface, as you can see, it does not look like much, but buried just beneath the surface, practically invisible in some cases, are pretty significant sites.
So we are coming up on the end of the excavation process that wrapped up a couple months ago. What will happen now that this phase of the project is over, and how will this history be preserved?
Well, as is the case with the Sarton Hotel, the physical part of the site that is in the TxDOT right-of-way will be covered up by the construction. But the artifacts go to Cox McLean, or they go to be analyzed and interpreted. This process takes a long time and a lot of expertise and a lot of research. Eventually, the materials from the excavations themselves will be curated at a museum. They have to be an authorized facility. I think UTSA has one. Texas State has one. Did I already say University of Texas? So the materials will be stored away for future research. If anybody is interested in asking questions about them, they can go visit them. The next step, there are multiple next steps, but not the least of which is a big technical report will come out of this, reporting our findings and our interpretations. That's not even getting into the public outreach side of it, where the historical research will continue. We'll continue coordinating with the local communities, not just the descendant communities, but general stakeholders who are interested in the area and want to have a say. So it's going to be a long, drawn-out process that should have some pretty interesting results. There are various other things that we want to do. Eventually, we want to have maybe a virtual site tour that people can visit online. The most immediate step is to start making those plans.
That sounds great, Kevin. Well, I do have one final question. It might be for you or Laura, I'm not really sure. So as an audience member that wanted to see many more pictures, by the way, many more pictures are available on the website. There's videos, there's field reports. And so Laura, Kevin, I think Laura might be better to answer this, but where can people go to find additional pictures and videos and the field reports for this particular project?
Sure, that's a great question. And so if people go to www.txdot.gov and they type in the keyword search Bolivar, it should pop up with our website, but I'll also grab the link here in just a second and put it in the chat window. So they'll be able to have some background information on the project itself, the transportation project, and where it's going to be built and the timing of that. There's several folders of photos and videos that our photographers took, and then we've got weekly updates from the excavation itself. And so if you guys have any other questions about that, feel free to hop online and do a little digging.
No pun intended, or was that?
No pun intended. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. So
well,
thank you so much. Yeah, I was gonna say thank you, Emily. Y'all, listening to you and Kevin and Howard talk about this project was really, really fun. And we were glad to have all of you on today, but don't leave yet because we've got questions from the audience. We've got a ton of questions. Remember, if you do have a question, type it in the chat box on the right or in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to as many as we can in the next 15 minutes. Some of them were already answered during the presentation. But Howard, some of these questions might be directed to you as well. So this first one, though, is for Kevin. People wanted to know, okay, is it possible to volunteer to work on excavation projects for a day?
It is, but there are procedures that we have to go through. In this particular case, we had to get special permission to involve the North Texas Archeological Society, and even in that case, we had to have. If anyone wanted to volunteer, they had to join the society, but the joining fee was about $20 or something like that. But as you can imagine, there's lots of liability and things that we can't just let anybody walk onto a project and start, excavating. It is possible, but only on a case-by-case basis. For interesting projects like this, you can contact us and ask, but we can do what we can, but it does take some special permissions.
And we will keep you guys updated. So be sure to subscribe to our pages. If you go to our website and type into the search box archaeology, we've got project pages happening, and it's not often that we do get to have participation just because of the safety issues of having archaeological sites along busy roads. But every once in a while, we have a special project like this where people do have an opportunity. Once things get back to normal and it's safe to be out and about around people, we hope to offer those opportunities as we can. But if you're subscribed to our page and continue to join us for these webinars, we'll keep you guys updated on those types of projects. I think the ones in Bolivar, though, are complete and there is no more fieldwork planned. So this question is for Howard. We had someone in the audience who was curious to know who these women were in the photographs.
The lady that I'm standing next to the poster or the in the museum with, that's Aunt Betty. That's oh, I'm sorry. I guess I need to unmute. Okay. That's Aunt Betty. That's the great granddaughter of Tom Cook. And the lady with me at the gravesite, that's my youngest daughter, Haley. So she's the great granddaughter of Tom Cook.
What was Haley's experience like?
Oh, she loved it. She couldn't get more involved because she works and she teaches and coaches. But she was very interested in it and talking to different people. And like I said, I don't know if she was the initial contact or maybe the second, maybe right after Aunt Betty. And she probably would have been out and involved more had it not been for her work schedule. But she was really enthusiastic, really excited. She's still excited about it.
That's really exciting. I can imagine trying to learn more about my great-great-grandmother who was from the Philippines, and being able to go to that site would be really cool. Now, Howard, Maria got in touch with you, I believe, directly. But I think, Kevin, you were trying to answer the question of how they were able to find the direct descendants. And I think part of that happened through the Denton County History Center, right? We were put in touch with some people who actually knew the location and contact information for the descendants of Tom Cook. Kevin, you're now unmuted. There you go.
Okay. The Denton County Historic, can you repeat that last part? You kind of broke up there a little bit.
I think it was the Denton County History Center, or I'm not exactly sure. I remember what it was called, but I think they were the ones who put us in touch with some of the descendants.
Let me see if I can find that. I believe you're absolutely right there. There's so many people involved.
And we actually do have their information, I believe, on our webpage as well, if you're interested in knowing more. And do you know, Kevin or Emily or Howard, if that panel in the background of that photo at the top right where is that, or where can people see that information?
That's at I guess the African American Museum on the, I think the name of the street, Mulberry. It's between Mulberry and I believe Oak Street. It's in the parking lot. And then, but that is the museum, the African American Museum is where that's located. It's inside one of the old houses that actually came from Quakertown, the old black community in Denton.
Yes.
And actually, we have another question about that from the audience. How have any, and maybe Rebecca, you might be able to answer this as well, have any connections to other nearby African American communities in Pilot Point, Denton's Quakertown and Freedmantown, or St. John's community near Aubrey? The Texas Freedom Colonies Project is slowly mapping outposts being recovered.
Again,
Oh,
I
I'm
didn't
not sure if, oh, sorry. I was going to say, I'm not sure if Bolivar was actually considered to be a freedom colony, since it was a town with a mix of both African American and white residents. But we definitely have been keeping the Texas Freedom Colonies group posted about this project, as well as some other projects that TxDOT has going on. You know, so we're in touch with them, I guess I could say, but I'm not real sure if they would consider Bolivar a freedom colony, since it wasn't solely African American or founded by previously enslaved people.
Thank you. And it looks like we've got some of the answers to the questions in the chat. Kim Cuppet at the Denton County Office of History and Culture provided her research on the Cook family to our team. And the museum that Howard mentioned is the Denton County African American Museum in Denton, Texas on 317 Mulberry Street. So that's exactly right. So here's a question, I guess for either Kevin or Emily. Who owned the land when TxDOT began this process? Was it still owned by the Descendants? And they're just sort of curious as to how Tom Cook acquired the property from the Englishman who initially had the property.
Yes, we're not really sure how he acquired the property yet. That's part of our research. Again, we think that he actually worked for the previous owners, and whether he earned up enough to buy it from them. And what happened to the property afterwards is still unclear. We do know that the property was purchased by a family named the Kurtzingers, who have been there in the community for a long time as well. Incidentally, they, under this circumstance, they gave us, thanks to them, they gave us permission to actually excavate minor excavations outside of our right-of-way on the adjacent private property, just to make sure we had a good idea of what's going on with the site. And along those lines, as I said, the Kurtzinger family has been there for a long time. During the excavations of the Sarton Hotel, one of the first interesting finds that we had was a small ceramic jug. It was probably a liquor sample that had the label Kurtzinger and Brothers or something like that. That the Kurtzingers actually had a shop at the time that the Sarton Hotel was there. So that was another connection to the past. But that's who the property, if I'm not mistaken, that's who the property belonged to at the time of acquisition, before that we purchased it.
Kevin, do you have any ideas why or how everything was buried or covered? One participant noted that it seems so recent that to have been naturally covered over time.
That's a mystery to me too, as well. The thing about historic sites is they're typically so shallow. This was probably just part of the landscape maintenance in the last 100 years. The interior of that structure you see in the picture was full of the rubble of walls that extended higher up out of the ground. But that, as I said, those rocks were just barely beneath the surface. Some of them you could see poking through. So 100 years of just leveling the land. Depending on the archaeological site and its setting, the way things get buried is very different. In a case like this, it must have just been continued use of the land over the last 100 years, burying things, removing things, things like that.
So I think a lot of people noticed the historical marker in the background of this photo, and they had questions about it. You know, what is that historical marker noting, and will a historical marker highlight these new discoveries? Will that be installed after the road expansion is completed?
Okay, the historical marker that's there in the photograph that's presently there, that is for the Bolivar Township itself, so the general community. That will have to be relocated at some point to make way for the new construction. And there is a proposal to have another historical marker nominated for the blacksmith shop itself, but that we're working towards that. That hasn't been settled yet.
Now, you had mentioned earlier about Chisholm Trail being close by. So one of the questions, does the current FM 45 follow a historic route connecting Bolivar and Sanger?
Yes, there has been a road there going way back to those times, yes. I believe the FM 2450, if I'm not mistaken, was called Main Street of Bolivar, the north-south one. But there was the highway between Sanger and Bolivar follows that same path.
And this question is either for you, Kevin, or even Howard. It was mentioned that Tom Cook was enslaved when he came to Fort Worth from Carolina. Do we have a record of when he was emancipated? I think Rebecca mentioned something about probably Juneteenth, along with the rest of the enslaved people in Texas.
Yeah, that's probably the case. That's what we believe.
I don't have any more knowledge about it, and I would assume Juneteenth would probably be correct.
Well, I think that pretty much covers all of the questions that we received in the chat. We have just a few more minutes if anyone has any last minute questions. Let me look here. Okay, so it says, what will happen to the site once construction begins? And Kevin, I know you sort of touched on this, but when we talk about the site being destroyed, I think we need to maybe give a little more detail about what that means. You know, parts of it being preserved, parts of it being destroyed by construction.
Okay, basically what will happen that is shown in this has already been filled in. What will happen is there are plans to extend FM 455 inward to the, I guess to the towards the right of the photo. So the ditch will be buried. The right of way, which I'm trying to see if I can see any indications of where the new edge of the right of way will be. But yes, everything that you see there where the hole is will be in the TxDOT right of way, but it will be buried underground and covered up. When I say destroyed, is yeah, they'll bring in heavy equipment and level that on land, and so basically our job is just to get in there and get as much information out of the ground as we can in advance of that. I don't know if that answered your question, but yes, they'll expand the highway, so there will be an expansion of the pavement, and then basically a shoulder going to the edge of the right of way, and possibly even ditch. I'm trying to recall the plans for this particular project, but I know there are plans for a sidewalk that might go over this section. I know there are plans on the north side, but there may be something like that here.
We have time for one last question. And I think you mentioned there's going to be additional research, but do you know, or do we know yet who brought Tom Cook to Texas?
Not that I'm aware of. I may be mistaken there. I'm not sure.
That's maybe something that we can follow up on as we continue to update the website with more information. And if you didn't hear earlier, it usually takes a few years for the analysis to be completed. As Kevin said, this is sort of a preliminary look at what we do anytime we're in the field, years before construction. But it usually takes a few years for our archaeology teams to work on analyzing the information, creating a narrative and a story, essentially. And we'll continue to update those things on our website, where you can find additional photos and videos. That's at TxDOT.gov, keyword search, archaeology. So before we go, I just wanted to thank everybody for their participation, especially Mr. Clark. It was such a pleasure having you on today to give your firsthand experience to this project. These things can oftentimes be really technical, even if they're interesting, but your participation has made it really special and personal for not only for the TxDOT staff and the archaeology team that's working in the field, but also to the people who are just learning about this project. So thank you so much, and we really look forward to working with you as we continue the research and analysis. Kevin, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said thank you. It was my pleasure.
And Kevin and Emily, Rebecca, thank you so much. This has been a really great roadside chat. For those of you who've joined us before, it's a little bit of a different format. I know that everybody in the comment section has enjoyed everyone's participation. So if you're still on, please, please, please take our survey after this webinar, subscribe to our pages online, and come to our next webinar. And please let us know if we can do anything for you in the future, any topics you're interested or people you're wanting to hear from. So I hope everyone has a safe and good day, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura.
Thanks, everyone.